Hey everybody, it's Shaman Sister Sin, and you're listening to the Meditations and More podcast brought to you by the Little Shaman, and that's me. Today I want to talk to you about the narcissistic spectrum. Narcissism as it affects people is a spectrum. That means there is a huge gray area of what narcissistic traits and behaviors a person can have and how they can affect a person. It starts out on one end with balanced self-focus, or what we sometimes hear called healthy narcissism, which would be things like balanced, realistic self-esteem, assertiveness, and other helpful attributes like that. The further down the spectrum it goes, though, the less helpful and the more detrimental these traits become. Realistic self-esteem becomes arrogance, or it would become insecurity the farther down the spectrum you go. Assertiveness will become aggressiveness, or it might become capitulation, which means just to give in. The further down the spectrum a person is, the more focus on the self there will be, and therefore the greater the inability to distinguish the self from the external world around it. The more focus on the self there is, the more destructive and damaging the personality traits and the behaviors are going to be. Narcissism as a thing is just a symptom, so to speak. It's a pathology that can exist in anyone, not just someone diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder or one of the other cluster B personality disorders. That's something that a lot of people don't realize. Just because someone is narcissistic doesn't mean they have been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, and it doesn't mean even that they should be. However, at a certain level, narcissism does become malignant. The narcissistic spectrum is why it's possible for people to have narcissistic traits, but not to be completely narcissistic. A person can be egotistical, for instance, and sure that they are right to the point of argument, but if you can prove them wrong or show them facts that contradict their belief, they will accept those facts. They will accept that they're wrong, and they'll change their belief. This is because their narcissistic traits are strong, but these traits are not too rigid and inflexible to adapt to the situation. What we see in malignant narcissism, which is on the far end of the spectrum, is the inability to adapt. We see the inability to accept input from the external world and use it to moderate their own feelings and beliefs. They actually do the opposite of that. They believe feelings are facts, so their feelings and beliefs moderate and modify their perception of the external world until everything agrees with how they feel, rather than simply seeing and accepting reality for what it is. This is why they accuse people of doing things they didn't do, or thinking things they don't think, or feeling feelings that the people do not feel. It's because everything they see has been perceived in such a way as to agree with how they already feel, even though their feelings really don't have anything to do with reality at all. This is why they can't seem to accept that they're wrong, even when demonstrably proven wrong. Their narcissistic traits are too inflexible to be able to adapt to the situation. This is tied in with their perception and whichever disorder that they have. The perception of malignantly narcissistic people is too clouded to be able to understand that there's a problem with the way they're behaving or the conclusions that they're coming to. Narcissism, therefore, has become not just a trait for them, but their entire way of being. Preservation of the self and fulfillment of need becomes the obsessive focus of the entire personality. This is not considered ordered or healthy functioning because it impairs the person's perception, their ability to relate to other people, and their ability to function in general. They are not perceiving reality correctly. They are, in a very real way, unable to see past their narcissism. This is when we call someone a narcissist. This is when people are diagnosed with a personality disorder. All of the cluster B personality disorders fall on the malignant end of the narcissistic spectrum. This means that with all cluster B personality disordered people, the level of narcissism, in other words, the amount of focus on the self, is disproportionately high. It's toxic and obsessive. The narcissistic traits displayed by these people are rigid, inflexible, and detrimental to their general functioning. The cluster B personality disorders are histrionic, borderline, narcissistic, and antisocial. There are generally different levels of narcissism involved in each disorder. For example, the level of narcissism you see in a person with histrionic personality disorder is not the same level of narcissism you'll see in a person with antisocial personality disorder, which is what we often call a psychopath or a sociopath. There is some overlap with these disorders, though, and it's not uncommon for a person to be diagnosed with more than one cluster B personality disorder. For example, we often see people diagnosed with both borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. That's one of the most common co-occurring personality disorders with BPD, as a matter of fact, is NPD. Or you'll see people with three of them: NPD, BPD, and APD. The most common comorbid condition besides substance abuse with a cluster B personality disorder is another cluster B personality disorder. This means that all people with cluster B personality disorders are malignant narcissists. It means their focus on themselves is so disproportionate, so obsessive, and so toxic that it literally affects the way their brain works. It doesn't mean they're bad people. Their behavior is what dictates whether they're bad people or not. So why does this happen? There are many factors. When a child is abused, for example, their brain reacts to this defensively. The child's needs are not being fulfilled, so they begin to focus on themselves in self-defense. If I can't rely on my family to fulfill my needs, I'm going to have to do it myself. Over time, and since abuse usually continues over years, this turns into inflexible pathological focus on the self and their own needs. While many of these children likely had the capacity for empathy at one point, they're never able to develop empathy or learn to care about other people because they're too focused on surviving. Unfortunately, the things that need to happen with children's development so that they learn to fulfill their own needs and take care of their own needs emotionally does not seem to happen with narcissists, probably because they're never able to recover from the abuse since it never stops. They can never process things or heal and move on. They become stuck in a loop of defending themselves and trying to survive, and they're unable to progress in their development past a certain point. They use immature, emergency type of defense mechanisms and coping strategies to deal with things in between the incidents of abuse, such as creating a false self that is all-powerful and immune to abuse, as we see in narcissistic personality disorder, or a victim persona that endlessly seeks sympathy, like you might see in histrionic personality disorder. And this becomes the only way they know how to deal with anything. This is why we still see these childish coping mechanisms when they're adults. They were never able to develop more mature coping mechanisms or learn how to deal with their emotions and these type of situations correctly. This is why everything is a tragedy to some narcissists, everything is an emergency, and everything is the worst thing that ever happened. It's also why nothing is a tragedy to other types of narcissists and nothing seems to matter to them at all. These particular narcissists probably learn to cope by not reacting. The differences here are probably based on their individual personalities and what worked for them in their lives. The narcissists who overreact as adults were probably able to get what they needed by doing so, whereas the underreacting narcissists were probably not. Let's say there are two different children who are living in abusive situations. Child A may have found that crying and becoming emotional caused the abuser to back off, while child B may have found that this only made the abuse worse. Over time, child A would be conditioned to react emotionally, and child B would be conditioned not to react at all. That's just an example, of course, because there are as many different types of situations as there are people in the world. But in general, that's how human behavior works. Behavior that has been rewarded will be repeated, and behavior that has been punished or even just not rewarded will be abandoned. It is the case with both types of people that their feelings are overwhelming, disproportionate, and threatening to them because they've never learned how to experience or deal with them normally. Whether they overreact and become hysterical, or whether they underreact and don't react at all, it's for the same reason. It's because their emotions are overwhelming them. Because of that, their feelings dictate their entire experience. This is their only reality. It's sadly ironic that the very feelings which run the narcissist's entire life are experienced as so frightening and alien by narcissists, as if they're coming from some unknown source and cannot be trusted. There's also the biological factor. It may be that some people are predisposed to narcissism for whatever reasons. In these cases, abuse or environmental situations would still factor in, but they would only be a part of the puzzle. There is research going on with this now, and maybe, hopefully, they'll have an answer about that someday. At any rate, it seems that the earlier and the more abusive the childhood situation is, the worse the narcissism will be in general. This is because of something called the narcissistic wound. I went into this in depth in a podcast I did called Are Psychopaths Actually Narcissists? So if you'd like more information, check that one out. Abusing children, neglecting them, invalidating them, ignoring them, spoiling them, abandoning them, enabling them, all these things can play a role in the development of narcissistic adults. Most narcissistic people, including psychopaths, do have a history of abuse. There is what seems to be a single exception to this, and that is the relatively rare phenomenon known as cold children. These children seem to be born psychopathic and seem to have experienced no abuse or abandonment at all. Whereas most children, even children that grow into narcissistic adults, seem to want love from their parents and are literally destroyed when they don't get it. These so-called cold children reject love. Love does not seem important to them and they're not interested in it. They are a mystery and no one understands why they are the way they are. Perhaps genetics will one day explain them, or perhaps we will discover abuse in their backgrounds that was unknown at the time. It's not outside the realm of possibility that some people are just born bad, as they say. They were born bad and they stay bad. These people are a mystery to analytical thought and to emotional understanding. So, there are different levels of narcissism in human behavior. Some are helpful, others are not helpful, or even detrimental. The farther down the spectrum it goes, the more toxic these traits become, until you end up with someone who has no understanding or feeling for other living things at all. I hope this clears a few things up for you. As always, I look forward to your comments, questions, and suggestions, so please keep those coming. You've been listening to the Meditations and More podcast brought to you by the Little Shaman. That's me. May the Great Spirit bless you and have a wonderful narcissist and psychopath-free day.